roll through our webinar today. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Hassan Alam, and I serve as the Advisory Director for Advocacy. I'm going to be your MC for today's program, along with my co-MC, David Howe, who's the chair of our Advocacy Committee and an arguing student at Castles. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land that I am speaking from. For thousands of years, it has been and continues to be the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As a part of this land acknowledgement, I invite myself first and all of you to reflect and learn about the history of the Indigenous territories on which you are situated and the colonization, displacement, and marginalization of Indigenous peoples which has taken place there. I also invite you to reflect upon the actions that you and your community are taking to engage in the ongoing process of truth and reconciliation. As a part of my own reflection on this, I want to share the fact that Advocacy's endorsement of the climate resolution that we're going to be discussing today is part of our commitment to the ongoing process of truth and reconciliation. Through this resolution, which calls on the legal profession to engage in the practice of law through a climate lens, our aim is to support the right of the Indigenous peoples of these territories to the conservation and protection of the environment, the productive capacity of their lands, and the protection of Indigenous laws, all of which were affirmed in this provincial government's 2019 commitment to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP. By way of introduction, this panel, which is entitled The Legal Community's Role in Addressing the Climate Crisis, is part 2 of a panel discussion which started last year with the same title. And that panel was aimed at giving an overview of why the legal profession needs to engage with the issue of climate change within our practice of law. As a result of that discussion, one of our audience members, Yuki Matsuno, was inspired by our panelists' call for action and proposed that a resolution be put forward at the Law Society AGM last year, which required the Law Society to encourage lawyers in BC to engage with climate change and its effects through a number of measures. Yuki Matsuno, myself, and a group of others, including Dr. Carol Liao, Advocacy's Advocacy Committee, drafted this resolution and brought it forward at last year's AGM. Now, unfortunately, it failed to pass by a very small margin, and something that we're going to explore more in our discussion itself. Now, as you'll hear our panelists talk or touch upon today, this resolution is a central part of our discussion because we simply don't want to be discussing why we as a profession need to engage with the climate crisis in our practice of law. We also want this discussion to be a call to action to support this resolution again at the upcoming Law Society AGM, because we recognize that the climate crisis is of an urgent nature, where we as a profession simply cannot sit at the sidelines and debate whether we have a role to play in this crisis, given that here in BC, we are at ground zero of the climate crisis in Canada. So with that said, I'll pass it over to David next to speak very briefly about this resolution I keep referencing. But before I do that, I'll give you an overview of our format for today. Each of our speakers will be giving some brief introductory remarks, after which we'll ask them some follow-up questions, and then we're going to open up the floor for a Q&A session. Now, you're welcome to put into the Q&A chat box all of your questions, and we'll keep track of those. You're also welcome to vote on and upvote the questions asked by other attendees if you like their question, and we'll make sure to prioritize the ones that are upvoted. And we hope to leave an adequate amount of time for a discussion of what our panelists touch upon, but also this resolution that I keep referencing. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Hassan. So we just wanted to provide you kind of a brief overview of the meat and potatoes of our proposed resolution. We have most of it drafted out. We have a nice preamble, but in order to kind of just get through and get to the bare bones of the resolution, we wanted to provide you all with kind of the 3 different the three different resolutions that we actually want to present. So the first resolution is that the Law Society encourage lawyers to engage with climate change and its effects in accordance with the Code of Conduct and other regulatory instruments of the Law Society by undertaking activities to adapt to and mitigate the effects of climate change, advocate for those who are disproportionately experiencing the negative effects of climate change, including but not limited to Indigenous peoples, and support efforts to make law and policy aimed at mitigating the effects of climate change, consistent with commitments under international treaties and domestic law. Advising their clients, as appropriate, of the material risks and opportunities associated with climate change, including those related to the fiduciary duties of individuals, directors, trustees, policymakers, and other fiduciaries in their governance of beneficiaries, nonprofit, corporate entities, and pension funds, and making efforts to reduce the climate impacts associated with their law practice, including greenhouse gas emissions, in keeping with available resources and geographic location. Next slide, please. The second and third resolutions being that the Law Society create an advisory committee or task force to study the topic of the role of lawyers in both advising clients and addressing climate change with the goal of developing further guidelines for lawyers in their practice, creating educational programming for lawyers and articled students, defining climate justice, and developing guidelines for climate conscious lawyering. And finally, that the Law Society provide to its members and the public, to the extent feasible, a report on the climate impacts of the Law Society and its operations, and a plan to reduce those impacts. So this is kind of the basis of what we're proposing, and we'll provide a link to a working doc in the chat when we get to our Q&A section for you to provide your comments on the full resolution. But we thought we would just give the main points here as kind of a basis for you to kind of wrap your head around where we're envisioning. But at this point, we're still very much open to your feedback and your comments. And so there'll be an opportunity to provide and share those later on in the session. So for now, I'd just like to introduce our speakers. First of all, sorry, could we get next slide as well, please? First of all, we have Dr. Carol Liao, who is an associate professor and director of the Center for Business Law at the UBC Allard School of Law. She is also the distinguished scholar of the Dillon Center for Business Ethics at the UBC Sauder School of Business, co-leads the Canada Climate Law Initiative, and is a member of the Faculty BC Advisory Committee. She is the recipient of the Influential Women in Business Award, BC Business Woman of the Year Award, and was named as one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by the Women's Executive Network. Terry Lynn Williams Davidson is a citizen of and general counsel to the Haida Nation. Since 1995, Terry Lynn has practiced in Indigenous environmental law, beginning with her representation of the Haida Nation at all levels of court, including the Supreme Court of Canada. She was lead counsel in litigation to protect the old growth forests of Haida Gwaii in Haida Nation, the leading case on consultation and accommodation of Indigenous rights. Terry Lynn serves on the Law Society of British Columbia's Truth and Reconciliation Advisory Committee, the Federation of Law Societies of Canada's Indigenous Advisory Council, the Dean's Advisory Committee for the Center for Business Law at Allard School of Law, and she is co-chair of the Indigenous Engagement in Regulatory Matters Task Force. Terry Lynn is also a co-principal investigator with the Canada Climate Law Initiative. And finally, we've got Bruno, who is the co-chair, Bruno Caron, who is the co-chair of Thomson Miller's ESG and Carbon Finance Group. He is a commercial lawyer whose practice is focused on capital markets and public and private M&A transactions. He has been recognized in Canada's Best Lawyers list in the category of mergers and acquisitions since 2021. And Bruno has a particular interest with all aspects of ESG and with respect to sustainable financing as a means to mitigate and adapt to climate change and the disclosure rules applicable to the risks associated with climate change. In 2020, Bruno was named to the Canadian Climate Governance Experts Panel of the Canada Climate Law Initiative and is frequently called on to present to boards of directors and trustees of pension funds on governance issues related to climate change. So without further ado, we'd like to give our panelists an opportunity to provide some of their initial comments and thoughts on the role of the legal community in addressing climate change. So Carol, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just put up some of my slides here. I'm really grateful to be here with you all to discuss our legal profession and climate change. And I'm very grateful to Faculty BC for hosting the session. And I appreciate very much the framing by our two wonderful chairs, Hassan and David. And in my very brief initial, 5 to 8 minutes or so to help kick off this session, I wanted to convey some information with the assistance of some slides. So thank you, everyone, for indulging me in that. First, I think those of us here are assuming some basic mutual understandings, which is that we all know climate change is real and that our civilization depends on a stable climate. And as put by the Supreme Court of Canada, climate change is a threat of the highest order in the country and indeed the world. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, comprised of hundreds of scientists from around the world, have showed us the very different and terrifying climate scenarios humanity will have to live through depending on what we do today. So how well we mitigate greenhouse gas emissions now is going to dictate the legacy we leave for future generations. So I'm going to assume people know that. And what I think is challenging for lawyers is understanding how that's relevant to us on a professional level. And that may be reflective of what happened last year with the vote. So, picking up on what Hassan said, the difference for yes or no votes last year was 383 votes, or 2.3% of eligible voters. There were more abstentions from that vote than the difference, meaning had most of those abstentions voted yes, it would have passed. I'll also note that only 18% of eligible members voted, meaning 13,217 Law Society members out of the 16,000 and change did not vote. Now, when the resolution was posted on the Law Society website prior to the vote, some of the comments below the resolution signaled that some members thought it wasn't part of the Law Society's mandate. So first, the mandate of the Law Society is to uphold and protect the public interest in the administration of justice, including establishing standards and programs for the education, professional responsibility, and competence of lawyers. This is also reflected in the strategic plan, including responding to challenges and opportunities in the delivery and regulation of legal services. Okay, so now with that mandate clear, I'd like to lay out quite specifically how and why that's relevant to climate competent lawyering and the resolution. So climate change poses an existential threat to humanity and significant risks to our financial systems. And these impacts are very real. Physical, acute, and chronic risks can cause direct damage to assets, operations, global supply chains. They increase costs, exacerbate employee safety, etc. Transition risks to a low carbon economy can be driven by changes to client, consumer and investor preferences, changes to government policies, unanticipated write-downs in carbon intensive industries. It includes liability risks for failure to disclose these material climate risks to your clients. To investors and stakeholders. So there is a global consensus that climate change is a financially material business risk, along with, of course, all the measurable and immeasurable social and environmental risks and harms. And these negative social, environmental, and financial impacts have disproportionate effects on Indigenous peoples, which Terry Lynn will discuss further, and there are racial disparities, gender differentiated impacts, disproportionate effects on the global South and on the poor and the most marginalized in our communities. Climate change differs because of the systemic and interconnected risks that can act as a risk multiplier, and there are implications for organizations and individuals. And, so we're seeing the rapid implementation of climate disclosure requirements around the world. This slide, like the others, I credit to the Canada Climate Law Initiative team. And what I really want to convey here is the significance of what is changing and the ripple effects. Okay, the federal government has issued a number of measures aimed at achieving a net zero carbon economy with the promise of bringing mandatory climate-related reporting in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which OSFI, which is the bank regulator, has also endorsed. Now, what that means is that climate disclosure is increasingly an access to capital issue, an access to money issue. Okay, and so lawyers, whether we like it or not, are going to have to understand what greenhouse gas emissions mean and upskill to be able to help our clients understand this rapidly evolving regulatory space and how to adapt. Courts around the world are also increasingly affirming the scientific evidence on climate change and that its harmful effects are reasonably foreseeable, and entities producing GHG emissions can be held responsible for failing to sufficiently reduce emissions. There is a tidal wave of climate and ESG-related litigation happening worldwide, with over 2,700 cases, landmark cases frequently altering the global legal landscape. I think I just got a firm notice today from, I'm on a lot of those mailing lists. And I saw the first climate lawsuit against a commercial bank for funding fossil fuel development happened today in France. More than 170 countries have introduced national laws and policies on climate change mitigation and adaptation. We're seeing plaintiffs willing to try new, creative, and really innovative legal arguments when it comes to climate across the court system, administrative tribunals, non-judicial bodies, some willing to even take on cases when the prospect of winning is very limited and unlikely. So climate litigation isn't going away, and lawyers need to understand this evolving space. So here's the thing. Climate resolutions are being passed at law societies and associations around the world already. It's not a radical or a controversial thing. The American Bar Association, representing 1.3 million members, adopted an updated climate resolution in 2019. Mandatory regulatory state bodies, including Oregon, DC, Hawaii, Maryland, New York, are just some equivalent law societies around the world that are undertaking to engage their members on competent climate change advising practices, as well as things lawyers can do about the way they practice law to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, what climate resolutions by an electorate do is they signal to the organization and embolden them to pursue a course of action. The International Bar Association has been really leading in terms of setting professional standards, advocacy, and conduct of the profession in relation to climate change. In 2020, they issued their climate crisis statement. They recognize that every lawyer needs to play a role, not just climate and energy lawyers. It's also insurance lawyers, commercial lawyers, property lawyers, and everyone else. Australia, Brazil, the Law Society of England and Wales followed along the leadership from the ABA and IBA by publishing climate change resolutions in 2021, 2022, and the Council of Bars and Law Societies in Europe, representing 1 million European lawyers from 31 member countries and 11 associate countries, also issued a task force and passed a resolution in 2022 and this year. I know lawyers like precedents, and from my research, it seems Canada is lagging behind many Commonwealth countries in preparing for climate competent lawyering, when, in my humble opinion, we should be leading it. And many other professional associations in Canada have already offered guidance to their members. CPA, which is a Chartered Professional Accountants, the Canadian Medical Association, BC Architects, Engineers, Geoscientists, the Planning Institute of BC, and this list continues to grow. So, you know, it's simply table stakes for 2023 for lawyers, bars, and law societies to recognize the importance of climate competent lawyering amidst the sustainability crises that we're in. Climate change guidance specific to the profession and the jurisdiction is in itself, it can cover what climate legal risk is, how it manifests and impacts, determining whether a lawyer is competent to advise on this, and how climate change is impacting your specific area of law, and also the broader ethical issues. For example, in England and Wales, the Law Society has issued guidance on climate change in relation to a lawyer's professional conduct duties and what they are required to think about when operating as a trusted officer of the court. Okay, and more broader questions on climate change and how they may impact your client intake. What does that mean in terms of greenwashing and your firm's credentials? You know, the Law Society is a professional body that should provide some clear guidance for key issues that lawyers are facing. And I was really pleased to see the president of the CBA BC branch, Aleem Barma, KC, posted a few weeks ago his Bar Talk piece affirming the importance of lawyers in recognizing the effects of climate change on their field and on their practice. Now, our track record in Canada isn't great, but we can change that. We have Bruno Caron here to discuss how the Barreau de Quebec managed to get 72% of the vote on their climate resolution, which tracked very similarly to ours. And I understand the Law Society of New Brunswick also passed a resolution, has implemented a task force, but climate resolutions have failed at the CBA national level and here in BC, which we hope does not happen again this year. And it should be noted that Canada is warming at double the global rate, and our GHG emissions per capita are one of the highest in the world. We're not doing our share. We are a natural resource economy, the mining capital of the world, with critical minerals needed for EVs, wind turbines, solar panels, paving the way in our clean energy transition away from fossil fuels towards wind, solar, and those other renewables. And BC's adoption of UNDRIP with DRIPA and our commitment to truth and reconciliation, I think the least we can do as lawyers, the least is to vote in favor of a climate resolution, signaling our recognition of these realities and the priorities we need to face as a profession. So we've given a 2-month lead. Please vote yes. Please vote in advanced voting when it opens or in person at the AGM. And please tell a lawyer who didn't vote last year to please do so this year, because it could make all the difference given the margins that we had last year. And every movement forward matters. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Liao, for that really powerful overview. And yes, powerful reminder to why we also need to vote for this resolution at the AGM. I'm just going to give a quick reminder to our attendees that you're welcome to state your questions in the Q&A box, which we're keeping track of. You're also welcome to type it in the chat box itself, and we'll keep track of it there. But yeah, we encourage you to start typing your questions now. I'm going to pass it over next to Terry Lynn Williams to continue with the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to join you today. I'm really happy to have Indigenous issues also a part of this important discussion about climate change. I'm just going to share my screen. Great. So I'm going to begin because we have limited time. I thought this is a succinct statement to talk about this particular impact upon Indigenous peoples. We have a multifaceted relationship with the land and sea that we've developed over millennia. We have relationships that other people do not have in this country. Climate change is the next wave of colonization, in that it's stealing the existence of Indigenous peoples and our rights by taking away the land and sea that our rights are so dependent upon, thereby making Canada's commitment to reconciliation unattainable. This is a statement I made for the Lawyers for Climate Justice in the National CBA resolution that was defeated that Carol spoke about. She's already talked about the words from the Supreme Court of Canada speaking about the importance of climate change, which I've set out here. I've also included a quote from the Right Honorable Beverly McLaughlin in 2021, who also gave a statement to Lawyers for Climate Change. And she said, dealing with climate change is among the most important challenges that will face Canada and the world in the 21st century. The impact of climate change will be especially felt by already vulnerable people, exacerbating the social and legal difficulties they face. So I will spend a few minutes talking about the disproportionate impacts on Indigenous peoples in two areas, generally just the importance of the environment to Indigenous peoples. So people think that lands and waters and the environment are important only for subsistence, but it's more than that. It's about a way of life. It reflects ecological knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge and ancient practices, and ensures the transmission of that intergenerationally among Indigenous peoples, as shown here in this image of a young girl with her child and her father passing on the knowledge of the land on the land, and also Indigenous laws, all of which I say are necessary for our collective survival, not just for Indigenous people's survival, but in these practices are some of the solutions to addressing the climate change crisis that we find ourselves in. Resurgence of Indigenous laws is the second area. I love this quote from Professor John Burroughs, who said that our laws are written on the earth. So when we want to see our Indigenous laws, they're on the land that is constantly changing around us as a result of climate change. Justice Bowman, Chief Justice Bowman from the BC courts has encouraged lawyers to hold space for Indigenous laws, and that Indigenous laws may be the instrument of repair of settler colonial law. And I'll come back to a quote from him a little bit later. So it's my emphasis that contributing to the resurgence of Indigenous laws will contribute to developing equitable and just solutions to climate change. As all of this climate change has been occurring over time, there has also been a transforming legal landscape with respect to Indigenous peoples, beginning in 1982 with the first efforts to pass the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And then more importantly, here in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which is really important to the work of law societies and our guidance as competent lawyers. And then in BC in 2019, you heard Hassan speak about the DRIPA legislation here in British Columbia, and then nationally in 2021, the UNDRIP legislation. So when Chief Justice Bowman has looked and articulated what he has called a duty to act, building upon an earlier statement from another Chief Justice. And he said the affirmation and the applicability of UNDRIP to British Columbia and Canadian law and the government's commitment to its implementation requires all elements of the state to engage with and implement its principles. Thus, in concrete way, through this new legislation referring to DRIPA, a duty to act has been layered on top of our duty to learn. And at the forefront of this effort is self-determination of Indigenous peoples. And he said further, if there's anything the last 200 years of Canadian Indigenous relations has taught us, is that our jealous need for control is destructive. Indigenous peoples have forcibly learned European language and history, became subject to settler colonial law, and were made to navigate a social system that did not reflect their values or traditions. The result was catastrophic. Now is the time to do what we should have done when we arrived here as uninvited guests. Demonstrate that we care enough to discover and learn, and to act responsibly within the matrix of Indigenous customs, traditions, and protocols. Now is the time for humility. So that has funneled down into the law societies. Here in British Columbia in 2015, the benches of the Law Society acknowledged that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission findings that for over a century, the central goal of Canada's Aboriginal policy can best be described as cultural genocide. They also recognize that lawyers have played and continue to play an active role in past and present injustices that affect Indigenous peoples. 3 years later, the Law Society adopted a Truth and Reconciliation Plan. In 2021, the Indigenous Intercultural Competency course has become mandatory for all lawyers in British Columbia. And last year, the benches approved an Indigenous Framework Report to advance reconciliation. Other law societies have taken similar approaches, including the National Federation of Law Societies, who've committed to truth and reconciliation and building bridges with Indigenous peoples. And I'm ending here with a beautiful piece of artwork, because I can. It's art from my husband, and it's entitled "What Will Be Left for Our Grandchildren." And so our impacts today as lawyers is not just impacting the physical environment, but it's impacting our relationship with Indigenous peoples. It's impacting our relationships with the environment, and it will impact our grandchildren's relationships with the environment, Indigenous peoples. And so I really thought it was an appropriate slide to share and to end, and just will say, please vote, please vote, please vote. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry Lynn. And finally, we will be joined by Bruno Caron, who will speak about his experiences in passing a similar climate resolution at the Barreau du Québec. Bruno, please, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Well, it's evening time for me, as you can see with the beautiful light I have. I will just move something because it's in my screen. So before I start, I'd like to thank the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers to have invited me to be a panelist during this event, and also I'm very pleased to be a guest with Carol and Terry Lynn, and I would also like to thank Hassan and David for putting this together. Obviously, I have to say that I was greatly inspired by an article I read about this time, or maybe a bit later in the spring last year, where Carol was quoted about her intention to present a resolution to the BC Bar, and in my mind it clicked. I said, what a wonderful idea. And I also reflected on the status of the legal profession in Quebec, and realized that I'm 56 years old, so I'm quite advanced in life, and I've got two beautiful daughters. One is 18, the other one is 16, and I project myself into their future, and obviously I'm a bit concerned about what I see and what I hear about the risk of climate change. And so putting all this together made me react. And for probably the first time in my life, I said, what do I have to lose? And so I took upon me to write a first piece on Lincoln, and advise people that I would present a resolution in the same line as the resolution that you were presented with last year, and you will be presented with this year. Obviously, I'm a corporate lawyer, so the procedure in Quebec is a bit different than in BC. I understand we don't have to put the resolution too much in advance. So what I did is I play a bit of a surprise game with the Barreau du Québec, and send my resolution at the very last minute before the deadline I could submit. The reaction was kind of not the warmest reaction at the beginning, but they warmed up to it, I believe, and I was able to present it to the General Assembly last year. And there were some discussion. I have to admit that during the debate over the resolution, there were some people who voiced their difference for that resolution, because I think there's a misunderstanding that the resolution is trying to force lawyer to in losing their neutrality in front of a client. We always pride ourselves that we can defend the good and the bad, and our job is to defend and represent people in the best way we can. And so I think the misconception or the misunderstanding comes from that. The aim of the resolution is to make the legal profession aware of this risk that is upon us, And contrary to, if I can make an analogy, contrary to the pandemic that we just experienced, there won't be any vaccine this time around. And so we won't be able to cure this issue overnight. It's going to affect our life, and it's going to affect our children's life, our quality of life. And it may create all sorts of problems that we cannot predict now. And I don't want to sound too pessimist here, but the big thing about this is it translates into a financial risk. And the financial risk will affect all facets of society. We've just seen recently banks in California being affected just because of the interest rate went up. We saw Credit Suisse go belly up. Just imagine if all the financial institutions are affected at the same time because of their loan portfolio is not worth what they thought it was. Insurance company not able to provide coverage because there are too many claims at one time because of this extreme climate event that occurs. I'll give you an example. I was in Ottawa this Monday at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, and I was sitting on a panel on sustainable finance, and there were a bunch of people from insurance companies, and one of them said that there was a big storm in Ontario last year, and just that event resulted in the highest number of claims for that company in its history. And so we're likely to experience those type of events. And I think that's important for us lawyers when we advise client, because we have a duty of care in the advice that we give to our clients, and we have also a duty to warn our client of potential risk, to be aware of those risks, understand them, and be able to explain them properly to client so that they can make their decision, whether they want to go on a path of net zero or they want to do something else. That's up to them. But at least we have a duty to understand the risk and be able to explain it. And so just for that reason, I believe it's very important for law societies across the country to provide trainings to their member about this new aspect of the practice of law that you didn't learn at when you were a lawyer at law school. So I would say that this is the reason why I thought that it would be appropriate to present the resolution in Quebec. And I was very happy to see the result, and also very happy that we were the first in the country to go ahead with this. Now, following this, if I may, there were some action from the Barreau du Québec, and I'm very pleased to report on them. So they changed their strategy to include climate change as one of the core components of their strategy as a professional corporation. They've also provided training to their board members and to the exec members and management on climate change. They've also encouraged staff of the Law Society to participate in actions to mitigate their carbon footprint. They've hired a consultant to calculate their carbon footprint and another consultant to come up with a communication strategy in order to prepare a guide, a bit like the guide that was published this week by the Law Society of England and Wales, to inform the profession about the climate change and the interaction between their duties as a lawyer, professional duties as a lawyer. They've also set up a special committee and invited me to be part of it. And on the committee, there are people from staff, from the syndic, which is the body responsible when there's some professional fault to do investigation. There's also the bâtonnière, the director of the Law Society, sits on that committee. So you see that they've taken this this issue very seriously, and they will be acting, and they've started acting on it. So I think I will stop here, and we'll be glad to answer any other questions.
Thank you so much, Bruno, for sharing your experience, and a big congratulations to you on this amazing victory that you had in Quebec. And I think that's for the betterment of the entire bar over there. And we hope to be celebrating a similar victory here very soon. So we're going to be switching gears a bit now and asking some follow-up questions to our panelists. But before I dive into the first question, I just want to point your attention to our chat box, because David has shared with you our resolution, and it's going to be in the form of a Google Doc where you can actually make comments on it. And I think it's important to say that you can make comments on it, because this resolution is not the final resolution that we're going to be putting forward. We are actively getting feedback from people in the legal community on how we can make this resolution even better and serve the interests of our bar here in BC. So if you want to have a voice, please click on the link and comment on the resolution. We'd love to hear from you and what you'd like to see this resolution look like. And thank you so much to all of you for putting your questions in the Q&A box. I see that the questions are flowing in, so please feel free to continue contributing to the Q&A. And now we're going to jump into some very brief follow-up questions. So Terry Lynn, I'll start with you. How do you think the law can be used to advance climate justice, and what role do legal professionals play in addressing climate change? And I think this question is especially suited to you, given all of the amazing litigation work that you've been doing in recent days around climate change here in our province.
Sure. So, I mean, we've heard some of the things that we should be doing as lawyers to be climate conscious lawyering, but specific to Indigenous peoples, that's what I'll speak about. I think that we have ethical obligations to advise our clients about the disproportionate impacts upon Indigenous peoples, racialized and marginalized communities about proposed developments, as we advise our clients about their proposed projects going forward. And to do that, we need to understand and recognize Indigenous laws when they are shared by Indigenous peoples. So far, most people in Canada are familiar with the body of law called Aboriginal law, which is Canadian law about Indigenous peoples, and not so much about Indigenous laws, which are our original laws, and are just starting to be shared with the rest of Canada by Indigenous peoples. And so often people don't know that. They might call it a principle or a value, but not fully understand that it's actually a law that should guide the work that we do. So I see one of the questions was about what the art piece represents. And so you may find laws embodied in art, like the art that I shared at the end of my presentation. And so my husband called it What Will Be Left for Our Grandchildren. And so that is a very stylistic form of art from the Northwest Coast of Canada. And he will present images that cause people to think about their place in society and finding balance. And so often balance is a law that's really integral to Indigenous peoples, is finding our balance and our place in the world. Aboriginal law has done some good things in trying to understand Indigenous laws. For instance, in the Delgamuukw case, they called this the inherent limit. Really, it's the sustainability limit. That limit has not yet been applied to determine whether developments can proceed or not, or the relief that might be provided in litigation. But I think that because of the climate crisis and because of these incredible disproportionate impacts on Indigenous peoples and our own existential threat, that we really have to start applying the inherent limit and looking at Indigenous laws with a different perspective through UNDRIP and through DRIPA, and the actually appreciating that these are incredible human rights impacts that we have to look at as lawyers, and we need to let our clients know about those impacts instead of just strictly looking at a balance sheet, or even just looking at it only considering climate law, but considering the impact on Indigenous peoples. Given that we've not been a part of the development of this country, we've not really been a part of this country. And so it's important to remember that in our work with our clients.
Thanks so much, Terry Lynn. Our next question, our next follow-up question is for Dr. Liao. Are there potential conflicts with respect to acting in the best interest of your client and adopting a climate justice practice of law?
Oh, thanks. I like that. That's a juicy question. And I think that's an important one to clarify too, because the resolutions that we've seen too around the world, they're put in terms of positive action and how lawyers are making sure that as part of your ethical duties, there are certain minimum things lawyers in this day and age need to know. It's quite universally agreed there are that to competently advise your client as pursuant to the codes of conduct at the law societies and jurisdictions you're in, you're going to have to speak credibly on issues such as climate change that impact that field of practice. And the thing is, you bear a duty as well to tell the client truthful advice regarding those situations, even if the client doesn't want to hear it. Lawyers can't ignore climate change and willfully refuse to see it. You know, I have here actually chapter 2 of the Code of Professional Conduct for the Law Society of BC, and it states that a lawyer should obtain sufficient knowledge of the relevant facts and give adequate consideration to the applicable law before advising a client, and give an open and undisguised opinion of the merits and probable results of the client's cause. It's the same with directors that have fiduciary duties to the corporation. You know, being a climate change denier, refusing to be educated, it isn't bringing a diversity of perspectives to the board or thinking you're serving the best interest of the corporation by not believing the science around you. You're reneging on your duty of care to the corporation, where you're required to exercise the care, diligence, and skill that a reasonably prudent person would make in comparable circumstances. It is in the best interest of the client for lawyers to provide sound, competent legal advice. And again, this isn't radical, it's necessary. Just because your client doesn't want to hear it doesn't make it untrue. And lawyers in every jurisdiction are going to be wrestling with the same issues in terms of climate change. You know, we're all increasingly going to be climate lawyers now, whether we like it or not. And, you know, as we try to move away in the world from fossil fuels toward clean energy systems, including electrification, wind, solar, and other renewables. The truth is we can't get there without lawyers. We draw up contracts, we advise clients, organizations, businesses, we assist communities, and we're going to need to adjust to a low carbon emitting future as lawyers. So there's need for that education and that upskilling. So no, I don't actually think it's quite necessary for us to provide that education, you know, in the best interests of serving the public interest and the client.
Thank you for that, Carol.
If I may, I would even add, if we do, when we do presentation for the Canada Climate Law Initiative, we obviously talk about the duty of care. And like if you want to do an analogy, a director that would refuse to consider climate change, you could argue that he's exercising bad faith, because the Supreme Court has recognized the issue. We have the Canadian Net Zero Emission Accountability Act. We know that the federal government is bound by that. We know that the economy will go towards net zero. And so closing your eyes and pretending it doesn't exist, you're running into one of the risks of climate change, which is the litigation risk. We have the physical risk, we have the transition risk, but there's also the litigation risk, and that's obviously for when you're advising a client, you need to warn them of all the risks. So I would just add that.
Great point. So Bruno, there seems to be a lot of questions targeted towards you from our audience, and they seem to be asking about strategy. So why don't I follow up with a question to you? From your own experiences in Quebec, what do you think the challenge or hesitancy is with respect to getting the legal community on board with respect to integrating a climate lens into the practice of law? And what lessons can be learned from jurisdictions such as yours, Quebec, who have successfully passed climate resolutions?
I think the issue comes from the historically, the legal community has always been seen as very conservative, very risk adverse, because we're in the business of advising our clients against risks, and we tend not to want to take any risk as a professional. Obviously, this is new, and everything that is new usually scares people a bit. So I think that's one of the issue about this, and we've maybe one thing I'd like to discuss, and it's maybe not related, but I'd like to make that point too. We're seeing in the corporate world, I'm practicing it, a shift from shareholder activism to stakeholder activism, or shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And as part of that, it's companies are starting to realize that profit is good, but profit is good if you are also a good corporate citizen. And being a good corporate citizen means that you have to take into account your stakeholders, including the environment. And if you look at the CBCA, there were some amendments towards that end. So if it's good for our client, why isn't it good for us as a law firm and as lawyers? We're especially like me, who's in a big law firm. We're seeing in the business world that being a good corporate citizen is rewarding for business. It's profitable. It attracts young employees in a very tight labor market. It attracts client, and lawyers always discuss like, how can we get new business from potential client? Well, the best way to engage with client is to tell a story. What better story is it to tell that your firm has taken action towards climate change and is thinking and taking action to be a good corporate citizen? Obviously, all law firms have adopted EDI policies, but very few have focused on their carbon footprint, and maybe because they think the characteristic of our business, like we're sitting in offices and we're not producing, we're producing stuff, but we're not making stuff from natural resources and stuff like that. And so we think we're not emitting any greenhouse, but that's not true. Like lawyers travel, they use goods, they buy photocopiers, they rent offices in buildings. So obviously there's a lot to do, and you have to take into account that your scope 1 emission will be someone else scope 3. So very soon our client will ask us about our carbon footprint. So I think it's just being a bit, having foresight and seeing what will be the future to try to adopt new ways of doing business.
Absolutely. And let's hope that lawyers in BC have the foresight to pass this climate resolution. So I think now we'll open up to some Q&A questions from our audience. And feel free to continue to add those questions in the Q&A box. But I think this is a really great one, kind of for all of our panelists here. How is climate change impacting and changing the practice of law? And what sorts of challenges does climate change present for lawyers and for their clients? I know we've kind of addressed those a little bit, but I'm curious to hear everybody's perspective on this. Terry Lynn, why don't you go first, if you don't mind?
It seems like the pressure is greater for lawyers who work in this area. For instance, we are seeking injunctive relief to stop the destruction of Indigenous territories, or herring fishing, or whatever the natural resource at issue is. And it really is having an impact on our clients. And just like people hear about youth facing climate anxiety, Indigenous peoples face that even greater. And some of the Indigenous peoples have participated in the youth challenges, I'm happy to say. But I think for me, that is really the greatest impact. I think it's a challenge that requires us to be more innovative and be more expansive in what we look at for our clients. Going back to an earlier question, you talked about the best interests of your client. And again, that's expanding the words best interest, because we've always looked at it in a very narrow way, in the same way that we've looked at law generally, but not included Indigenous people. So it requires literally putting on new glasses to see the changing environment and the changing legal landscape that we all work within now.
Thank you. Carol?
Thank you. And thank you, Terry Lynn and Bruno. I was trying to find the clapping emoji I should have in the corner when you both were speaking, and particularly Bruno, that was actually a great point, I thought, illuminating on how it's actually a great recruiting method too, because right now, as someone who is helping educate that next generation of lawyers, they care, right? And so climate change, it impacts different areas of the law in different ways and differently across jurisdictions. So that's why this resolution is important, because lawyers should be looking to the professional membership body for guidance. And I believe the Law Society of England and Wales are developing a net zero protocol for law firms so that their members understand how to operate their law firm in a way which is aligned with, I think it's called the SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative, and how law firms can set net zero targets which are in line with international standards. And so there are these different elements to it, because lawyers also need to understand how this fast-moving climate agenda and energy transition is impacting their area of practice, as well as the business of law and the delivery of legal services. It is also about preempting climate legal risk and ensuring lawyers can continue to advise their clients competently and compliantly, right? Like the effects of climate change on their clients and on their own legal practices are wide-ranging and constantly evolving. And so lawyers need to be aware of the changing landscape and its potential impact upon their organizations, as well as on the legal advice that they provide. Okay, right now it's just about getting it on the agenda. And I'll just make this other point too, which is that lawyers are diverse. But the point is, whatever your politics, whatever your beliefs, the objective data is very clear that climate change is going to increasingly become a central part of whatever field of practice they do. Real estate, corporate transactions, insurance, criminal law, even simply the matter of being a good ethical lawyer requires that you've got to have that climate competency skill set in this day and age. And it's our governing association's job in all respective jurisdictions to get that message out and get, in a way that lawyers will internalize to help them actually carry it out. So, this to me is that first step. And again, what I press on is how, when you see what the other law societies and associations are doing, it's a question now of us not being a laggard in this. Yeah, so.
Bruno, any comments from you?
Well, obviously climate change brings risk, and we've talked about risk, and negative. But there's the other side of climate change, which is it brings opportunities, and it brings opportunities in the practice of law. For example, I do sustainable finance. 10 years ago, no one talked about sustainable finance. No one talked about green bonds, and no one talked about green loans. And so those are new field of practice that are developing, and there will be other field of practice as well because of climate change. And so there are some opportunities, but obviously you need to be aware of climate change and what it means and all the intricacy of it. And we've talked a lot about climate change because we had the Paris Accord, we had definite targets. You could see them, 1.5, 2 degrees, net zero by 2050, but we have to take into account also the loss of biodiversity because the two are interlinked. And we haven't talked about biodiversity too much because COP15 was supposed to be held in China, and we had the pandemic, and it was pushed back, and it finally was held in Montreal, and they finally got a framework agreed upon. But I think in the coming years, the two will have to be dealt together because we understand now that a loss of biodiversity exacerbate climate change. And so it's if we preserve biodiversity, we will. It's a very good tool to keep the emissions, reduce the emissions. And so I don't want to muddle all the discussion, but you see that it's interrelated. It goes back to Terry's discourse, which was like we have to care about the land we lived in. It's not infinite, and we now realize as human, we wanted to master nature, but we won't be able to do that. Nature will master us, and so we have to realize that.
Important point to end on, that nature will master us, and it is in fact doing that right now. We're gonna close up with one last question to our panelists, which is that why do you think this climate resolution is important, and why should lawyers in BC care about this resolution, and what do you think are the strategies that people who care about this resolution passing can employ to ensure that it does in fact pass here in BC? What are the sort of actions that people can take? So Carrie Lynn, why don't we start with you?
No, I'm not going to start first this time.
Okay, Carol, over to you.
Okay, so this resolution is important because it is about translating that to action, which these law societies around the world are already beginning to do, right? In England and Wales, the Regulatory Law Society, right, has implemented a climate change task force, which meets routinely. It provides periodic reports to the executive. They provide continuing legal education, and just recently again announced its climate guidelines, which covers what climate legal risk is, how it's impacting the law, outlining the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, what that means. Right, so the role of bars, the law societies and associations, there's this mix of both voluntary groups and the mandatory regulatory bodies that bring lawyers together, and they're ensuring competency. Again, the Law Society of BC's vision in their strategic plan is to be a leading regulator, right? That promotes a culture of innovation, inclusivity in responding to these challenges and opportunities, which, I'm grateful to Bruno for pointing out too. We're seeing a lot of opportunities in this space as well. And they are mandated by the Legal Profession Act to ensure the competence of lawyers, okay? And so mitigating climate change and ensuring lawyers are up to speed on the climate science and the impacts of climate change on their field of law, and the competence in advising their clients on climate-related risks and opportunities, and the legal and regulatory shifts in the law. This is, as well as their own practice of lawyering, it is upholding and protecting the public interest in the administration of justice. It is also about capacity building. And, Bruno mentioned the Paris Agreement. There's also the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, the UN Sustainable Development Goals. These are things that we're watching other bar associations talking amongst themselves to try and figure out how to provide this information to lawyers so that they can read that into their daily practice, right? It's about providing that information to help lawyers continue to be competent in this rapidly accelerating, demanding space, that across several different stakeholders. And, as Bruno mentioned with his children, we don't have to have cognitive dissonance in the way we practice law and what we want for future generations. Right? Like, so to me, it's this opportunity. And the thing is, for those that aren't ready, we're going to have to come around, because it is going to be this long march facing climate risk and nature's realities. So carrot or stick, it's happening, right?
Thank you, Dr. Liao. Bruno, do you have any comments, maybe especially on what specific strategies we can employ to really get this climate resolution past the finish line?
Right.
Well, from an old guy, I would say social media is very effective, and so you should try to use it to the best you can. I'm a bit amazed, because I would have imagined that, following what happened in Quebec and New Brunswick, the management or the executive of other bar society in Canada would take cognizance of it and would act by themselves and not wait for a member to present a resolution. I'm still like, I just don't understand it, because obviously Carol has mentioned a bunch of like TCFD, the Paris Accord, the United Nations development goals. We've moved, like, this area of law was mostly soft law, and now we're seeing a shift from the soft law and from a disclosure regime to something more stringent, because we're now understanding the urgency, and we've been very late in acting. And so you'll see a shift from soft law to real law. And that's why it's very important for lawyers to know about it, because it will be part of their practice. And the other thing I would add is, we're in Quebec, we say that we are officiers de justice. We are public officers. We have to uphold justice, and we have to have the trust of the public in what we're doing. And so, how can we have the trust of the public if we pretend that climate change doesn't exist? When the IPCC report, and there's a consensus, a scientific consensus, that climate change is real and will have effect. So to me, it's a willful blindness to pretend that it's not of our business. It's living on a different planet. And that's I will stop there.
Totally, thanks. We had a question that came in at the last minute in our Q&A, and I think it's a really great question. So
what about Terry Lynn?
Oh,
the last question.
Right, sorry. Terry Lynn,
she didn't want to go first, but I don't know, maybe she did.
Of course.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to this this analogy of what happened here on the Northwest Coast with Indigenous peoples, where we had beautiful homes that were completely covered in art. And through the colonization process, everything was eventually taken away so that we had none of our beautiful cultural objects left. Our whole house was taken away and taken by the colonizers. And I feel that's kind of where we are, really, is that things are being taken away. We're getting left with an empty house. The legal landscape is changing before us. Chief Justice Finch talked about how, with respect to Indigenous laws, we need to make space for a new legal landscape, and we need to do that with respect to climate law as well. Indigenous peoples are all about transformation. All of the stories, all of the narratives that we share, our Indigenous laws are about a constant state of transformation to adapt to things. That's why we've been so resilient in the face of climate change. And we have to transform. And in British Columbia, this vote is really important because we're behind, as Carol said, we're behind in Canada, we're behind in the country. We have to also transform at this point. Like this vote and people not voting it's kind of symptomatic of society in general, in that most people are apathetic and they don't vote. And with respect to climate, most people don't know what they can do. And so this resolution is an actual concrete first step that you can take, and you can feel good that you're empowering yourself to take a first step, and then we'll see where it goes from there. And there's a lot of things we could engage in once the resolution passes and we have a task force and all these things. But it's really important to actually just take that first step and encourage those people who are really depressed about feeling like they don't know what to do, but there's such a great opportunity to transform where we are into the next stage of our enlightenment, really. Thank you.
So well said. Thank you, Terry Lynn. And yes, step by step, let's take that first step. Let's have the courage to do that. And just kind of to close it off very briefly, we have a question from the audience. Can you advise what outreach and education is being done in BC to convince lawyers who are either not aware of the resolution or who are on the fence to vote in favor of the resolution? What kind of resources are out there for lawyers?
Well, I'll just say first, there's this panel. There's also a resource list getting created. Actually, I think we were going to pop it maybe in the chat too, for people to have just as a beginning. But this is kind of something that is from a lawyer version of a grassroots need to spread the word. And we all have our circles and particular practice areas where people know each other. And so there is, it has to have legs, so people on this that are watching this webinar, which we're recording and we'll make available and we'll spread through social media, it was one that can be shared, as well as just informing people that But I would just say, if everyone who voted yes told one other person, then we'd probably have it. And we can do our best, but there's only so many people. And the BC Advocacy Committee is pretty amazing. But for those that are there are groups that we can't reach. It's much more powerful when there's word of mouth. And just conversations. In fact, there's a lot of studies that talk about how it's that conversation that you had with your former law school classmate about the state of the, that suddenly made the CEO green his whole business, right? So it's those conversations too that we have with people we know, and that's why this is an attempt to kind of exponentially spread that message. So please do that.
Thank you, Carol. I think given that we're at the 6:45 mark, we'll wrap up this amazing discussion. I want to start by thanking Carol, Terry Lynn, Bruno for sharing your knowledge and expertise today. I've learned so much, and I'm sure our virtual attendees have greatly benefited from what you've spoken about. You covered a large breadth of topics in a very short amount of time. So we really, really appreciate you giving your time and expertise today. I'll also close by saying that there's been a lot of questions asked about how you can support this resolution. And I think, as Carol said, there's a multitude of ways that you can do that. I've just shared in the chat box the resource guide that we've put together for you to go through and learn more about why this resolution matters, why we as a profession need to engage with this topic. And you can also use this as an educational tool for those that you're going to convince to vote for this resolution. Share it in your law firm, share it in the legal organization that you work in, or your community. I'm also going to remind you all that advanced voting opens on June 2nd. Please vote for this resolution and please spread the word. And also, if you're interested in helping this resolution pass, we will be sending out an email to all of the registrants asking whether you want to help us to get the vote out. Because as Carol mentioned, there's only a very small percentage, unfortunately, of people that actually vote in the Law Society AGM. And it's really about numbers when it comes to this resolution. We need people to show up to vote. I think there's a lot of people who care about the climate. There's a lot of people who want to see this resolution pass, but what really matters at the end of the day is people actually opening up their browser and clicking and voting for this resolution. So with that, I'll pass it over to David.
Thanks so much. And again, thank you so much to our panelists. You were also fantastic. On behalf of Faculty BC and our Advocacy Committee, we want to thank all of you as well for joining us today. And we wanted to close off by just letting you know that our next big event will be a workers speaker series, which the Advocacy Committee will be kicking off with a first panel on gig workers and issues that they face. That will be on May 17th, so please keep an eye out on your inbox for information on that event shortly. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a wonderful evening.